Welcome everyone to Working Through It Wednesday. We are so pleased today to have with us Dr. Cynthia Anderson, and we are going to get started working through it Wednesday with Dr. Cynthia Anderson, talking about functional behavior assessments and some of the pitfalls that happen through her expertise. I'm going to introduce her now because she has a plethora of information to offer us, and we are so thankful that she's here today. Dr. Anderson is the Senior Vice President of Applied Behavioral Analysis for the May Institute. She holds a joint appointment as Director of May Institute's National Autism Center. Dr. Anderson oversees clinical services at the May Institute and promotes research and dissemination of evidence-based practices through the National Autism Center. Dr. Anderson received her PhD in clinical child psychology from West Virginia University. She's a licensed psychologist and a board-certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. Much of Dr. Anderson's research concerns systems change. She is particularly interested in better understanding barriers and enablers to sustained and high-quality implementation of evidence-based practices, and using that understanding to increase the adoption and use of such practices. Much of Dr. Anderson's research has been supported by federally funded from the Department of Education and Institute for Education Sciences and Offices of Special Education Programs through the Department of Defense. She is an expert in the field, and we are so thankful to have her with us as we work through it Wednesday together. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to get to work with folks in my neighboring state. So I live in North Carolina. May Institute is in Massachusetts, but I live in North Carolina. So we are neighbors, I suppose.
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen, or attempt to. There we go. And go ahead and get started. So Erin asked me to talk about functional behavior assessment today. And of course, for everybody who knows anything about functional assessment, it's not really possible to go into great depth in that in 30 minutes. So as I'm sure all of you know, functional behavior assessment is required under IDEA in some cases. And I think it's generally just a good idea when typical interventions like changing a child's seating arrangement or using some kind of incentive system hasn't worked. Unfortunately, the FBA process requires a pretty in-depth conceptual understanding of how the environment can affect a student's behavior if it's going to be useful. And a lot of times that knowledge base gets kind of skipped over or doesn't get brought into the process enough. And so there's, I think, a lot of room for error in the process. And so what I was hoping to do today, because we obviously can't go into depth in how to do a functional assessment in 30 minutes, that's something that would take like a half day or a day or even longer. So what I thought we might try to do instead is talk about some common areas in a functional behavior assessment where it can go to the dark side, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. So, of course, the reason why we conduct a functional behavior assessment ultimately is that it should lead to an intervention that's going to be effective. So an intervention that is going to help the student do better in school, or for teachers, make life a little less crazy. And so these are the general areas that I think of as being the purpose of a functional behavior assessment. And in each of these areas, there are a number of things that can go wrong. And so I'm going to walk through these areas briefly with you. But before we do that, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what the different types of functional behavior assessment are. And so I like to think of functional behavior assessment as occurring along a continuum of control, where on the one end, you have indirect assessments where you're not doing anything at all in the classroom or where the student is. You're just talking to the student or a teacher or a parent to get information. And then at the other end, there are experimental methods of functional analysis where you're actually changing something in the classroom or environment to see how that affects a student's behavior. In schools, I tend to think of indirect and then kind of in the middle observations as being really the type of functional assessment that educators are doing and should be able to do. Experimental functional analysis can be super difficult and really requires a pretty advanced level of expertise. Today, I'm going to focus on interviews specifically because that's really the foundation for all functional behavior assessment. I'm not going to talk about rating scales because the research on rating scales has shown them to be really not very useful. They have really poor reliability and validity, and so I really recommend against their use. So one of the first areas where I think things can go wrong in a functional behavior assessment is at the start of an interview. Often an FBA interview starts like this. So tell me what's going on. And what you tend to get is a kind of a laundry list of problem behaviors and possible reasons. And when you have a big pile of behaviors and reasons, it can be not so useful to figure out how to untangle it to develop an intervention. And so one way that you can avoid this problem is by focusing on what I like to call functional routines. And a functional routine is just any sort of event that occurs most days, or maybe every other day. So it might be doing seat work or small group instruction, or anytime there's less structured and fewer adults, like at recess or in the cafeteria. And what you're looking for, excuse me, is routines that occur frequently and where that problem behavior is more likely to occur. And then you can focus your whole functional behavior assessment on those routines. And the reason that that's important is that sometimes one behavior, let's say yelling, might occur during independent work and at recess, but the reason might be really different. So a student might yell during independent work because she's frustrated and wants to get out of doing something or get the teacher to help her. But she might scream and yell at recess because the students are annoying her and she wants to have the swing set to herself. So that's why we really focus on specific routines. Even when you're focusing on specific routines, though, we can sometimes run into trouble depending on how the problem itself is conceptualized. Many people try to focus on what I think of as like all the problems or everything but the kitchen sink. And the problem with doing this is that it's going to make the FBA really difficult to complete. It's very likely that if there's a lot of different behaviors, they're occurring for a lot of different reasons. And so this is why you might end up with, like we talked about a few minutes ago, a functional assessment that says that behavior is happening to get attention and to avoid attention and to get out of doing work and to get access to preferred things and to avoid peers and to get peer attention and for stimulation. And of course, that sort of hypothesis really doesn't give us any information about what to do. So we really want to avoid that. And I think that one of the best ways to avoid that is to really prioritize what you're focusing on. So instead of focusing on all the problems, you might work with a teacher to pick one problem and focus on that. You might pick the most serious concern, the one that is causing the biggest difficulty for a student or a teacher, or you might pick the behavior that's most likely to respond to intervention. And I go this route if I really want to get buy-in from a teacher, or if I want to get buy-in from a student, I might go with what I think is going to respond most quickly. Now, I said focus on one problem, but oftentimes the students that we're focused on, these behaviors kind of cascade, and it's like this chain, and it starts out really small, but before you know it, you have a huge blow up on your hands. And this is an example of that. And so this is something that probably you've seen before. So the teacher says very kindly and innocuously, "Hey, Jason, turn in your assignment." And Jason says, "Huh? What assignment?" And the teacher says, "The one you didn't finish in class?" And Jason says, "I finished it." And she says, "Great, turn it in." I don't have it with me." "Well, you have a choice. You can turn it in or do it again." And now you can see we're starting to escalate. "Well, you never believe me." "Well, I guess you made the choice to do it again." And here we have make me. And now the teacher's in some trouble because what's she going to do? Is she going to back down and reinforce this behavior? Or is she going to push and maybe have a major meltdown on your hands? And so she says, "Well, that's really disrespectful. I need you to go to the office." And here things really escalate where the student swears at her. The teacher moves in a little bit to try to, I think, have him go to the office, and he pulls back, he raises his fist, and now she's in a real mess. So your teacher might say, "Well, where do I focus here?" And many of us probably say, "Well, I'm going to where he says make me, or where he swears, or where he threatens, or maybe where he throws the chair." The problem is So much has happened before that. And if you focus your functional behavior assessment on one of those big behaviors, you're missing the actual trigger. So when you have behaviors that occur in a sequence like that, although it's tempting to focus on the one that seems like the problem, which is like down in here, what we really want to do is focus here. You want to focus on the first behavior in that chain. And it might be a mild behavior, but if you've got a sequence of behaviors that reliably occur and together, focus on the first one and the mildest one. Because if you do that, your intervention is hopefully going to let you avoid that whole escalation. And it's so much easier to prevent a problem than to deal with it once it already happens. So don't go down here. This is a mistake we often make in functional behavior assessment. You want to start with that first mild behavior in the chain.
Dr. Anderson, I love what you said there about keeping it simple and starting in the beginning. Do you feel like when you start with the interviews, like you said, often the pitfall is, tell me what's going on, that immediately they tell you the end rather than the beginning?
Yeah, that's absolutely what happens. And so that's where I find I getting routines. And so I'll often ask a teacher for a schedule and then go through and pinpoint the routines where problems happen most often. And then when a teacher says something like, oh, you know, he threatens me, you're gonna want to walk back. Well, what happens before that, and get that whole sequence, and then you can focus on the starting point. Because absolutely, a teacher's biggest concern are these behaviors down here where he's threatening, he's being belligerent, he's being disrespectful. But to be able to solve the problem for her, you need to start at the beginning.
Thank you.
So once you know the behavior or the chain of behaviors that you're going to focus on, the next area where things can go wrong is in how you define the behavior. And I think it's really easy to skip over this, especially if you know the student and you know the teacher, or maybe you're the teacher yourself, because you think, well, I know what it looks like. But I can tell you from personal experience, because I've certainly done this, that that leads to all sorts of problems. Because it leads us to be kind of subjective or watch a student and go, was that a threat or wasn't that a threat? So you really want to take the time to define the behavior really clearly. And so an operational definition really focuses on what the student says or does. So we're looking for overt behavior, specifically what the student does. And you have to be really objective. One of the things that we often do is that we try to include intent, like she is trying to annoy me, or she threw it because she wanted to hurt someone. And the problem with that is no one really knows intent except for the person who's doing the behavior. So you really have to leave intent out. And so you might code aggression as throwing objects that land within a foot of a person. And of course, it's true if you do that, that you might get some accidents in there, but we never know for sure. And so it's better to have your definition focus on what you can actually see happen. The other thing that I like to think of with a good definition is it needs to pass what I call the stranger test. And the stranger test means that if I were to come into that classroom or into that cafeteria or in the bus line and watch the student, if you gave me that definition, would I be able to record when that behavior happened and have my observation agree with yours? That's the stranger test. And if your definition can't pass that test, then it's probably not objective enough and you're going to get into some trouble with it. So you really want to spend time thinking about an objective definition that I could come in, you could hand me the definition, point out the student, and I could observe, and then we would agree on when it happened. If you do those things, you're going to be in much better shape. So let's look at a couple of quick examples. Let's say that we have Jack, and the behavior you're targeting is the teacher labels it as manipulative. So, oh, this is not working at all. I can't see those things at all. So in white, and so that we can barely see it, is he does these things. He takes other people's things, he gossips, he tries to annoy others, he lies about another's behavior, and he does willful deception. And so if we go through these, taking others' things passes those tests. Gossiping, if you passes that test. Trying to annoy others is a problem because you don't know what Jack is trying to do. And similarly, willful deception is a problem because I don't know when he's trying to deceive on purpose versus when it looks that way. So again, this is just some examples when you try to think about what makes something a good definition, should meet all of these criteria. So the next area of functional assessment where things can go wrong, can go off the cliff, is in trying to understand why the behavior is happening in the first place. When we're trying to understand why someone does something, often I think as humans, we want to know the real reason. We really want to understand, well, why is she doing this? Why, how did this get this way? And although that might be interesting and maybe useful in some ways, more often than not, that kind of big why, it's not so helpful. For example, a number of years ago now, I worked with a little girl who had some intellectual disability. She had had a bad head injury, and she engaged in pretty bad self-injurious behavior where she would bang her head and hit her head with her fists. And it turned out, and I was asking, well, why is this happening? Well, it turned out that this little girl who was now 6, when she was about 18 months old, her father, who had a significant drinking problem, had come home one night and he was just very, very drunk, and his daughter was crying, and he threw her down the stairs. And the result of that was significant head trauma that resulted in her severe intellectual delay. And so that's just a tragic story. And of course, the cause of her self-injury, I suppose, is that head injury. But you see, that's the big why. But knowing that doesn't help me figure out what I can do now to help her stop hurting herself. And so what I needed to focus on is what we might call the little why. And the little why is why things are happening now. It's things that are going on now. So with my child with self-injury, what's going on now that's making that self-injury likely to occur? What's happening after the self-injury that makes it continue? In schools in particular, we have a lot of students who have really difficult life circumstances, and certainly those life circumstances contribute to difficulties at school. For example, a child might have a really bad home life, and that probably is contributing to problems at school. But I don't know how to change that child's home life, and so if I stop my functional assessment with that cause or explanation, I'm not going to be helpful in terms of figuring out things that we can do to help the students succeed at school. And so when you're doing a functional behavior assessment, you want to focus on things that are going on in school that you potentially can alter, because those are going to be the variables that you can change to help a student be more successful. It's not that those other things don't matter, it's that our ability to change them is really small. And so the functional behavior assessment needs to focus on the things that we can change. So in terms of trying to understand the why, what we're doing is we want to focus on the things that come before, which are technically called antecedents or triggers, and what happens after the behavior, the consequences. In both of these areas, you want to focus on things that happen just before and just after the behavior first, those proximal events. What is it that's occurring just before and just after? Because our behavior is most sensitive to those immediate triggers and immediate consequences. And the other thing that we really want to do is you want to look outside the person. We can't really control what's happening inside a person. So she might be feeling relief or feeling happy, but I can't get inside a person with a little screwdriver and trigger relief. I have to change what happens out here that makes her feel relieved. So it's important to focus on those things that are in the classroom, in the recess room, that you can potentially change. If you focus on things you can't change, the functional behavior assessment's not going to be useful to you. So my mantra is keep it simple. Start with a simple explanation. Look for things that happen just before and after the behavior. And if and only if those aren't helping you really figure out what's going on, then you can start to look for more complicated kinds of things, like setting events, like taking medication or not getting enough sleep. But more often than not, focusing on those immediate events is going to be enough to help you come up with an effective strategy. Okay, so Common triggers for problem behavior are what people are doing, what others are saying, or what the expectation is for what should be happening. These are things that often make behavior happen. And so setting events are those things that are there sometimes and not there others. Autism is not a setting event. It's there all the time. Parents getting divorced is not a setting event. It's there all the time. Setting events are things that when they are there, that trigger, like a request to do something, 100% makes the behavior happen. But when it's not there, the behavior doesn't happen. So I might ask a child to do something, and if she's gotten enough sleep, she willingly does it. But if she hasn't, she doesn't do it. That's a setting event. So that is a common setting event: not getting enough sleep, not having something to eat, getting in a fight with a parent in the morning. Those kind of things are setting events. But again, try to figure out what's going on without them first, because your intervention is going to be much simpler. So here are some key questions that I ask, and I apologize, when I made these slides, the white text looked really, really good, and at least on what I'm seeing, I can hardly read it. So I'm going to try to get through this, and I'm going to be squinting at you, and I'm going to be squinting because I can't read my own slides, which is, pretty embarrassing. So
I can see it. It's highlighted, and it's nice because we get to hear your analogy, your description of it. So we can see it a little bit, but then we get to hear from you exactly what it is.
Because I can see it a little bit. So these are some of the questions that I ask when I'm trying to really get at what is a trigger. So I like to ask, well, what's going on just before? And when you ask that question, you want to get really specific. So a teacher might say, oh, well, we're just hanging out, getting ready to do math. Okay, well, who's in the room? What are other students doing? What are you doing? What's the student herself doing? Well, what's the expectation? Or what are students supposed to have on their desks? You want to get really specific about exactly what's happening. And if it is, like, sometimes teachers will say, oh, well, it's just during math. Well, if it's during math, that means that behavior will be happening the whole time during math. But that's probably not the case. So you want to figure out, what's the thing that triggers it? What does somebody do? What does somebody say? What's the expectation that's been laid out? And then from there, I like to ask some specific probe questions. And if you all want, I have an interview that has these questions all in it, and I'm happy to share it with Erin, and then she can share it with anybody who wants it as well.
Yes, please. That would be wonderful.
And so I like to ask questions like, okay, well, so if I were going to come in the room and watch, and I really wanted to see this behavior, what's the number one thing you could do to make it happen? And so what would you do? If you really wanted to happen, what would you do so I could see it? And then so she might say, well, I would say, everybody take out your books and turn to page 33. And I would say, okay, so if there's nothing else going on and everybody else was out of the classroom, and we did this 4 days in a row, and every day you said, okay, Raymond, take out your book and turn to page 33. How many times do you think he would refuse to do so? And if she says, well, it wouldn't happen unless the other students were in there, I go, oh, we're on to something now. So you can ask these kind of probe questions. And then the last question I would ask would be something like, well, does Raymond ever get defiant when you haven't told him to take out his math book? Because there might be other things too. So these are questions that I like to ask that help me really hone in and make sure I'm on the right track in terms of figuring out what that trigger is. Because the more you can have a really discrete and clear trigger, the easier it's going to be to intervene. And we do the same thing with consequences. So in terms of consequences, I'm asking the same kind of really specific questions. So tell me, okay, so you've told Raymond to take out his math book and turn to page 33, and he says no, or I don't want to, or I don't have it. What happens next? And what I want to know is, well, what do you do? What do the other students do? And also, what does Raymond do? Because she might say, I don't do anything. At that point, I just ignore it. Okay, what do the other students do? Well, they just ignore him too. Well, that sounds like nothing. It sounds like no consequence. But the important question then to ask is, well, what's Raymond doing? Because if Raymond is staring off into space or doodling or something else, he's avoiding doing his work. So there is a consequence. So you want to ask, like those same kind of super specific follow-up questions that you ask for the triggers, so that you can have a really discrete consequence that is either leading to reinforcing that behavior, or maybe is leading to the next behavior in that chain. Because if she says, so she says, everybody get out your math book and turn to page 33, and Raymond just sits there, and then she says, Raymond, take out your math book and turn to page 33, and he says, I don't have it. You see, we're into this chain. And so you want to kind of understand how that all unfolds and what the escalating sequence is. The goal of this is to come up with a hypothesis statement where you have a really clear trigger, the thing that when it happens, so you're in a routine like in math class, that's the first step to your hypothesis statement, and then you have a really clear trigger when asked to do a specific work, like take out his book or go to the board and do something, the behavior that happens, he passively or actively refuses, and what the consequence is. He avoids doing the work, or the teacher continues to push and he escalates and eventually escapes. So he's still getting the same function either way, he's avoiding the work. So that's what you want, is a clear statement that identifies really discrete triggers and really discrete consequences, because that's the information that's going to help you build the intervention. And of course, that is the most important part of a functional behavior assessment. And the other pitfall, if we go back to our earlier slides, I wonder if I can do that, where you want to know what the student wants, you want the student to do instead, and how to help that student do better. Those are the other two big pitfalls, where we have a hypothesis statement, but turning it into intervention can be really hard. And Erin's asked me if I would come back and talk with that group more in the future about how to do that. I'm certainly happy to. But I thought that I would just end with thinking a little bit more about consequences, so thinking a little bit about what students can get or avoid. And it might be peer attention, it might be not avoiding doing work, but getting help, which is a reasonable thing, avoiding work altogether. There's lots of different things that might maintain a behavior. Here we have the student being sent to the office. And we think of an office a lot as being escape, but I don't know how much time you all spend in offices, but I do a lot of work in schools, a lot of school consultation, which means I spend a lot of time waiting in offices. And I am here to tell you that the office is the hub of activity. And when you sit in that office, you get all sorts of interesting information about what's going on in the school. And so there might be other reasons that student wants to go to the office too. So just here are some probe questions that you can ask and to try to get at some of those key questions. And we've already talked about these a little bit. So how do other adults respond? What do peers do? What does a student start or stop doing? And I like to ask some of those probe questions too. So of the last 10 times you asked Raymond to do some specific work in math and he said no or he couldn't, how many times did you follow up with this? How many times did that happen? You can also then set up a test case and say, okay, well, let's pretend that you've asked Raymond to get out his math book and he says no, or he says make me. And then you say, oh, you have to go to the office. How likely is it that what would he do next? So you can set up test cases to really test your hypothesis too. So these are some of the things I like to do in a functional assessment. Again, I have an FBA interview that I will give to Erin. So if any of you want it, you are welcome to have it. I thought I would just end by talking just super briefly about the systems to have in place to make this work in a school, because doing a good functional behavior assessment and good behavior support planning, so building that intervention, really is a collaborative process and it's a team process. So to build capacity in schools to do functional behavior assessment, the first thing I like to ask the school is, when you do FBAs, do the kids get better? Do the kids get better? Do they stay in the current placement, and do they get better? Because if they're not, it's probably not something wrong with your students. It's probably something wrong with your FBA process. So then you can kind of start to go through that. It might be that you're just not doing the FBA early enough, or you might not have people that are skilled in doing it. There's all sorts of reasons why, but that's the first thing for me to help think about. And then It takes having people who really understand the logic of functional behavior assessment. This logic comes from a field called behavior analysis or behavioral psychology, where we really understand the lots of different ways that the environment can affect behavior and how we get at understanding that. So you have to have people who are really good at conducting an FBA interview and really helping lead a teacher or other adult or student through questions that help them hone in on what the problem is. Even if the teacher wants to focus on the throwing the desk, really helping the teacher be motivated to focus on a big sigh. So you have to have, it's a big skill set. And then, there are students who are going to need a functional analysis, and that's that experimental end. Do you have access to people who can do that? And do your teachers really understand how the environment affects behavior? These are the kind of systems things that when I work with schools and districts, we really focus on building this capacity. And as you start to think about in your schools, these are some of the things that you might think about. So I think I am done. I know it's not a how to do a functional assessment by any stretch, but I hope that some of these tips might help you problem solve some of the ways that FBA can kind of go off that cliff in a school.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. It helped me to understand as well. I haven't done one of these in a while myself, but I remember exactly what you're talking about with some of these pitfalls. I love your language around keeping it simple and focusing on what is within your control. You also used a lot of solution-focused language, focusing on what we can do to fix the problem, focusing on the little y rather than the big Y, because we can't sometimes control or understand that. And that's really important to remember as we talk about in general what we can do for students, but also what we can do for our systems in our schools. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, and thank you. Just by all means, from myself, I learned, and I know that we're going to share this with all of our schools and within the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Sure, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Erin.
Absolutely. And we're going to be back again, hopefully, for the second part of the behavior intervention planning and discussing with Dr. Anderson some ideas and strategies around that as well. So look for that in our next Working Through It Wednesday session. As of now, check our website or our Facebook for the calendar of events that we offer through the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina. Thank you again, Dr. Anderson. We'll be seeing you soon.
Thank you.